The Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg has reopened after closing during the COVID-19 pandemic. They're celebrating by hosting an exhibition on the life and legacy of Archbishop Tutu. The Truth to Power exhibition is currently open and runs until April next year. For more on this, I'm joined by the museum curator, Emilia Potenza. Emilia, pleasure to have you on the program this evening. Firstly, why this exhibition and why now?
Thanks, Nhlanhla. Well, let me first start by saying that we did celebrate the reopening of the museum today. And just to let viewers know that we are open from Wednesdays to Sundays and on public holidays. And that really every South African should visit the Apartheid Museum. If you haven't already, it's okay, but please find time to make a visit to the Apartheid Museum. It's an essential visit. And in fact, you know, so many international tourists come through Johannesburg only to visit the Apartheid Museum. So it's strange that South Africans don't recognize it as something, you know, on their must-do list, but hopefully that's about to change. Now, why the Tutu exhibition and why now? The Tutu exhibition is our new temporary exhibition, and it's something that we worked on throughout COVID, even before the passing of the Arch. But obviously after Desmond Tutu's passing in December last year, it became even more important to tell the story of Tutu's life and to celebrate his legacy. Tutu must be one of our finest, and it is quite extraordinary that he is so under-celebrated in South Africa, and this is something that surely must change. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the content of the exhibition, if I may. The exhibition covers 5 areas of his life, and the first is Apartheid Education, the most evil act of all. And why we start with that is because in 1953, when Bantu education was introduced, both Tutu and his wife Leah were teachers, and for both of them it became impossible to continue to be teachers, and that's how Tutu ended up entering the priesthood. In that same vein, he predicted in May 1976 that unless something happened, very urgently, that there was likely to be bloodshed in Soweto. And he wrote a letter, an impassioned letter, to B.J. Vorster, the Prime Minister at the time. And the response he got was, everything is fine in Soweto, the people are perfectly happy. And as we know now, less than 3 weeks later, the Soweto uprising took place. And the fact that he was able to predict that really propelled him onto the national stage. We then look at the theme of the struggle in the church. And of course, you know, apartheid was justified in Christian terms and was given a biblical justification. Right. And the progressive churches challenged that and said, you know, that apartheid was a false gospel and it was unchristian and it was fundamentally unjust and you know, that they challenged it from that point of view. And Tutu became, you know, very much at the forefront of that movement. And that resulted in him taking the campaign onto the international stage in his campaign for sanctions against the apartheid government. And so we explore that, which was a very unpopular position. And he became, you know, quite hated by, you know, many South Africans for, you know, being, you know, not having the interests of the country at heart and, you know, things like that by campaigning for sanctions. We then look at the fact that he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1984 and how that made him untouchable. And that gave him, you know, much more ammunition in his campaign against the apartheid regime. He also became the first black Archbishop of the Anglican Church in 1986. which was an incredible landmark. We also look at how he was so central to the struggle inside the country in the 1980s, on the streets and in the stadiums, and particularly at mass political funerals, where only he, because of his stature, because of his role as a cleric, was able to contain the anger and the pain and the grief of the masses of South Africans, and to channel that into something constructive, rather than, to avoid bloodshed. And then we look at the role that he played as the chairperson of the TRC, and how heartbreaking it was for him, really, that almost all the recommendations of the TRC were ignored by the government, and that reparations were not granted, that out of the 300 people who the TRC recommended should be prosecuted, only 3 have been prosecuted to date.
Let's speak a bit more about the theme, truth to power.
Yes.
We do know the figure that is the Archbishop Desmond Tutu to be one that spoke quite strongly against apartheid, but even post-apartheid in democratic South Africa, one won't even forget that strong statement that he made during the Zuma years, warning and using the example of what happened in the fall of apartheid to the present government as well. Let's speak more about the theme, that is truth to power.
Yes, and exactly that, that he said, watch out. He said, watch out. And that watch out was really, him expressing his anger and fury when the Dalai Lama was refused a visa by the Zuma government. And he said, you will see your demise, just as the Nationalist Party saw its demise, because, your behavior is unacceptable. He spoke out against corruption. He spoke out against the fact that the divide between the haves and the have-nots in South Africa is unconscionable, and that, the ruling party, should be making that, their first and foremost concern. He also spoke out against homophobia. He said, I cannot worship a homophobic God. And he spoke out against, and promoted gay rights within and outside the church, long before this idea was broadly accepted. He advocated for the ordination of women in the church in the face of stubborn patriarchy. So he was, he had enormous courage, an enormous willingness to defy. And this was an essential moral and political weapon for Tutu. I mean, the other characteristic of Tutu was his incredible humanity. And although he was probably the most talented orator of his generation, his politics was never driven by slogans or a desire for power. He never lost sight of human beings at the center of the story. In fact, that's why he could step in and rescue a person from being necklaced. That's why he could lead the TRC with such grace. And that's why he could stand up against corruption. One more aspect that I think is critical to focus on is his commitment to contemplation. That no matter what the demands on his time, Tutu spent hours every day in private prayer and meditation. His faith was the wellspring from which everything else in his life was nourished. The exhibition is beautiful, besides, having, such powerful content and it's such a call to action, the exhibition. And it's saying that, yes, we are going through immensely challenging times. And certainly Tutu faced equally challenging times during his years of leadership in the church and in the political struggle. But what he teaches us is that rather than despairing, we should take action. And I think it is a time for all of us especially the younger generation, to take action, to fight back against the decline that we are witnessing in so many areas of life in South Africa, and particularly against corruption and the way that that is eroding our society.
That was the Apartheid Museum curator, Emilia Potenza, telling us a bit more there about the exhibition that's paying homage and also reflecting on the life and times of the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu.